had the privilege of learning a little bit about being an expert witness and some of the interesting things that go along with that, as you know, being a professional acoustician. So he's going to share some of those insights with us today, which I hope will be interesting for the students in the room, for the faculty who might think about being expert witnesses, and for our corporate sponsors who may need to use expert witnesses from time to time. You might gain a little insight from this as well. So please help me thank Dr. Gabrielson for being here, and we're looking forward to his talk.
Great. It's a great group. Couldn't ask for a better audience here. It's not a job, it's an adventure. That used to be the slogan of the US Navy, but it's certainly still the slogan of people working in acoustics. So if you're going into acoustics, watch out. You might do some things you never expected to do, and this is one of them in my career. It happened toward the end of the career. So let's jump in. I'm going to try and give you some context as the progression of this process of being an expert witness, but I'm going to try and mix some of the science and the engineering in as well, and we'll see how well that goes. So 2013, July of 2013, a small charter plane was taking off from a regional airport in Alaska, and it left the ground, climbed steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper till it lost its ability to fly, rolled over and hit the ground. Didn't even leave the airport property. It crashed before it reached the end of the airport property. Now, being a single engine charter plane, there is no voice recorder, there's no data recorder required for these planes. But one of the passengers was taking an iPhone video out the side window of the plane. And that video captured the takeoff, actually the taxi to the takeoff point, the takeoff, the climb, and all the way to the end of the flight. So a lawyer that was representing the engine manufacturer on the airplane contacted one of our former students at Boeing and said, would you please do an audio analysis of this iPhone video? And he said he didn't have time to do it, but he said, why don't you contact Dr. Gabrielson and see if he's the sucker, see if he'll agree to do it. So that's how it all started. And I said, yes. I had no idea it was going to turn into a 6 or 7 year odyssey. But that's what happens when you don't have much control. So October 2016, I was hired, and then things started to roll from that point on. One of the points of contention centered around the drive shaft for the airplane's engine. From the wreckage, they found the drive shaft. They found the shaft, and it had broken. It failed in shear, as you'd expect it might. So the plaintiffs claimed that the engine failed during the climb out, and that caused the crash. The airplane airplane engine manufacturer claimed no, it was running normally until it hit the ground. When it hits the ground, the propeller hits the ground, stops suddenly, and breaks the shaft. So this was the point of primary contention here. It's a very interesting process to see what happens. The NTSB did a full report on the accident. I linked it in the abstract. I don't know, did anybody look that up? Okay, that's a pretty interesting piece of this puzzle as well. How much effort they put into trying to understand what happens to the airplane. There were experts hired on both sides that knew a lot about propellers and what happens when airplanes hit the ground when their landing gear is up or when they hit in an unusual attitude and the propeller hits first. Interesting, though, that the damage on the propeller was used on both sides. One side said, well, the propeller blade is curved like this, and that indicates that the engine was running under full power when it hit the ground. The other side expert says, Well, the propeller blade was bent like this, and that indicates that the engine was not turning when it hit the ground. So there were several things like that, the damage to the propeller, damage to the engine, where both sides used the same evidence to make an argument, and that's not terribly helpful. There were some other small issues as well. The principal things that I was involved in, though, well, the principal thing was the audio file that came along with the iPhone video. Now, one thing that happened was that the National Transportation Safety Board looked at the video itself. And it's actually a pretty clever process that they went through. They looked out the side window of the airplane through this video. You can see parts of the airplane. You can see the ground close to the airplane. You can see the ground far away from the airplane. You can see trees. You can see fence posts. And they used all of these cues to try and reconstruct the trajectory of the airplane. And that's what I'm showing here. This is straight from the NTSB report. So they figured out what the speed was. That's the black curve. Figured out what the altitude was. That's the blue dashed curve. And then the pitch angle of the airplane is the red curve. So you see, looking at the altitude curve, that kind of guides you through this process. When the altitude is 0, it's still on the runway. It hasn't left the runway yet. And then it starts this climb. You can also see what happens, the airspeed drops. What else do we have here? The pitch angle is changing as well. Particularly the pitch angle toward the end of the flight. The pitch angle keeps increasing and increasing. It's tempting to look at that line as a straight sloped line and think that's the angle, but that's not it. The angle is increasing linearly with time, so you're getting that curve. They made a conclusion about what caused the crash. They said there were several factors. But here's another interesting thing about the legal process. Prior to the trial, the attorneys on either side are allowed to make arguments, pretrial arguments, before a judge. Turns out they didn't do it for the judge that actually did the trial. But that doesn't matter. You can make different sorts of arguments at that time, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. But one important one was that they argued that the NTSB conclusions were prejudicial. If you just accepted the NTSB conclusions, then case closed, nothing more to be done. And apparently, as is relatively common in aircraft accidents or transportation accidents in general, they often will disallow the NTSB conclusions. They allowed all of the factual information, for example, those plots of trajectory. They allowed all of the factual evidence from the NTSB, but they did not allow to be brought up in court the conclusions of the NTSB. They wanted the jury to look at this case without being biased that way. So I met with the attorney. We talked about the case. He said, I've got iPhone videos. It was an iPhone 5 at that time. We have this video. We want you to take a look at it. We want you to see what you can infer from the audio file. And right away I said, well, don't get your hopes up too high, because the audio and the video on an iPhone media file are compressed. So there's no guarantee that what you're seeing on the video is accurate frame by frame. But also, more important for me, there was no guarantee that the audio file was an accurate representation of the sound field. So I said, oh, we have to start somewhere. Let's be careful with this. Let's not jump into this problem. So we needed a test. The folks from Honeywell, the engine manufacturer, had already started planning to do a flight test. So we met with the folks from Honeywell, talked about what should be done, and arranged test flights for January in Alaska. That was Great choice. Could have been worse, could have been worse. We talked about this need to verify what's happening with the phone. So the attorney said he's got a line on a couple of iPhone 5s. He bought a couple of iPhone 5s. He said, let's fly these just the way they flew in the accident aircraft, but we'll also use quality measurement microphones. One right next to the iPhone, one on the other side of the aisle from the iPhone, and then several more videos that the flight dynamics people wanted, video files of the instrument panel, which also have audio files. So there was quite a bit of stuff that we put together for that. And the attorney also found an airplane that was configured the same way as the accident airplane. This is the test flight airplane I'm showing you here. It's a single engine turboprop plane. Has a 4-bladed propeller. It's run by a turbine engine. I'll show you some of the mechanics of the turbine engine because they play a big role in this analysis. And this is January in Alaska. So I already talked about what you want. You want to do a comparison as close as you can get with a high quality measurement microphone and the iPhone file. I won't keep you hanging any longer. I was impressed after going through this cycle how good the audio file from an iPhone 5 is. That's the only phone we tested. But it turns out to be exceptionally good in fidelity over its limited band. The idea in the test file, the test flights, that is to try to replicate as much as possible, being safe, the trajectory of the flight. So I'm going to show you some videos from the test flight. One of them, the one that you see on the left here, the vertical format one, that's the video taken with the iPhone out the side window, the same side window that the passenger took. You'll see a few things. You'll see the wing on top, and there's a diagnostic piece of information from the wing on the farthest left part of the wing. You can see the flap is down. The flap is actually in landing position, not takeoff position, and that's something the NTSB pointed out. Look at the angle between the ground. Let's see, I think this cursor shows up. Look at the angle between these. This is about halfway through the steepening climb that was done. Try not to make these too long. But you'll see that angle open up a little bit, and then you'll see the airplane roll, and you'll lose visual contact with the ground, and then the ground will come back in to contact. So let me run this. So you get a little bit of the picture here, looking out the side window. When you lose the visual contact to the ground, well, anything could be happening, but then you see the ground come back in. I'm going to just play it again so that you can see it, having had the background now of seeing it once. If you're following the angle of the wing and the angle of the horizon there, once the ground comes back into view, you can see that the nose is down. So the pilot is starting the recovery from this flight condition. The second video, the horizontal format video, is clearly looking out the front windscreen over the instrument panel. It's a little bit harder to see the ground in this. You can see the ground a little bit off to the left of the instrument panel, or in the panel that curves around. You can see a little bit of it off to the right. But it's overexposed, so it's a little bit hard to see. At any rate, you'll see what's happening. You'll see the angle increase and then the roll from a little bit different perspective. And a little bit more dramatic too. You're getting a few more visual cues as to what's happening on the airplane. Again, I'll run it a second time. How much work the pilot is doing. Right hand's on the power lever, left hand's on the control wheel. And he's pretty busy. But you can see it's a fairly violent, might not be the right way to say it, but it's not a normal flight attitude. It's kind of a scary flight attitude. Having gone through the test flights and analyzed that data, next task was to write a report. A report would have been due in the summer, fall, I guess, fall of 2017. So 6 or 8 months after the test flights were done. And what do you do there? Well, that was completely up to me to generate that. I had little guidance. There are some parts of this report that are standard boilerplate. That's not even very interesting stuff. So what would you talk about here? And I was trying to condense the science into a document that non-scientists could read, which is always an interesting challenge. And I think it's something that's useful to do. You get so in with your own community that you kind of forget that things can be explained to folks who aren't used to it. Spectrogram was the heart of what I was showing because it gives a nice time frequency visualization of what's happening. But that's only true if there are signals that you can identify on the spectrogram as coming from the plane. This is a cutaway pictorial of the engine itself. I'm not going to spend much time here because this is so complicated. But the things to see are engine on the left, gearbox on the right, the propeller goes on that thing labeled propeller shaft. Lots of vanes, lots of moving parts with vanes or blades on them. And anytime you have something like that, you have this rotating machinery, you have cyclical stuff going on. You might see a tone that's associated once per revolution of the shaft, or 4 times the revolution of the propeller shaft because there are 4 blades on the propeller, or 15 times the engine shaft because there are 15 blades on one of the compressors. So we get all of this information. The jury is ultimately the arbiter of science in these kinds of discussions. They are the folks who make the decision as to whether the science you are saying makes sense or not. If you just confuse them, you could be correct, but you wouldn't get anywhere with them. So it has to be explained in a way that they understand it, and that's really the big challenge. When I was going through this, I did get a little bit of guidance from the attorneys. They said, you have to tell them what acoustics is, because they're not necessarily going to know what that is. Science of sound, what's sound? Do they really know what sound is? Sound, vibrations of the air. These are things that you can talk about pretty easily if you think about it for a little while. But then the spectrogram is kind of an interesting tool to use. So what I did there was I did a live demo with a piece of spectrogram software. Raven Light from Cornell University is the package that I use. And let's see if I can get that going. So instead of making a lot of explanation about this, I tried to use sounds to get across the points here. Sure, on the vertical axis, there's something called rate, something per second. A few things per second down here, a lot of things per second up here. And time is marching on. Got some wind noise there. I didn't make that mistake when I was talking to the jury. So this is pretty easy. A whistle. Not a particularly clean, pure tone, but you get the idea that if I whistle with a higher pitch, the line moves up, and whistle with a lower pitch, and the line moves down. So this gives them this connection between what they're hearing and what they're seeing here. But I can go a step further. A whistle is a surprisingly clean tone. If you expand out the time series for a whistle, it looks very much like a sine wave. But many sounds are more complicated than that. And what you'll see in those more complicated sounds sometimes are multiples of these lines. You'll see the line structure, and then another one, and another one, another one, another one, another one. They're evenly spaced. And this is when the jury realizes that I made a good choice going into engineering and not music. But this is also important. Look at the way the lines change. They don't stay a fixed distance from each other. The lines are moving up, but they're also getting farther apart. And this is an essential thing to try and get across here if you're identifying sounds to a device like an engine. I did some other things. I just talked and showed them that that's a pretty complicated waveform too. And then a bang like that gives a lot of frequency content, but in a very short period of time. So that's essentially what I did. And in fact, I spent a little bit less time there than I did here. Okay, back to. I was careful with words. Hertz has no place in the courtroom. Nobody knows what that is. Not even sure everybody in this room could give a good definition of what a hertz is. A simple example, 5-bladed fan. Turn the fan on, see the lines sweep up to some steady state. They stay there until you turn the fan off, and then they drop back down. It's nice to make progression in small steps. For a fan like this, you can point out the rate of the shaft running around is this bottom dark line. 5 times that in rate shows how many blades pass a particular point. So you have blades per second pass a particular point. And these show up very nicely. This is a little bit cleaner view of the important stuff for this engine. Propeller on the far right in this diagram, it has 4 blades. I wasn't artistic enough to show 4 here, but there are 4 blades there. So we'd expect to see a line related to the rotation rate of the propeller shaft, but also 4 times that related to the blades. Now, here's where the iPhone does limit the ability to see things. The shaft rate is about 26 rotations per second. That's too low for the iPhone to pick up. They don't want to respond to frequencies that low because a lot of wind noise is down there. So that's gone. But 4 times it takes it just a little bit above 100 puffs per second, if you like. And that shows up. Yeah. What else shows up? Well, the engine side is on the left. The shaft I've drawn in 2 pieces, a red part and a blue part. The blue part rotates inside the red part there. They're fixed together at the far left end. They are not fixed together at the right-hand end of the red shaft. So you have this case where sort of an outer sleeve clamped on an inner rod. And when this thing is turning, the more stress that's on the gearbox and consequently the propeller, the more the angle changes, the relative angle between the sheath and the inner rod. And they actually sense that angle and translate that into torque. And that comes up on the instrument panel as a review. Okay, that's interesting, but not terribly relevant. The blue part is the torsion shaft, and that's the piece that broke. And it broke toward the left-hand side. But what's happening? That shaft assembly is carrying the compressor blades, which compress the air coming into the engine prior to its burning. Then the fuel-air mixture burns and goes flying out the back through the turbine section, and the turbine section is what extracts the power from that flow. They say about 25% of the power from the turbines goes to driving the propeller, and 75% is waste. Compressors, a 15-bladed professor, 17-bladed compressor. The turbines, 36 or 38 blade. Now, the shaft is going through a reduction gearbox to the propeller. So the engine shaft is turning much faster than the propeller shaft. The engine shaft is turning at about 700 rotations per second. And then, on top of that, if you have a 15-blade compressor, that 15-blade compressor is going to produce a signature at 15 times 700, which is a little bit over 10,000. The 17-blade is close to 12,000. The 38 and the 36-bladed propellers are over 20,000 puffs per second. That's too high for the iPhone to pick up. So the iPhone doesn't see what's happening in the turbine section. It doesn't see what's happening at the propeller shaft. But it does capture, the bandwidth does capture the 4 blades, the blade rate, propeller blade rate, PBR. It does capture the engine shaft rate, which is about 700 rotations per second. And it does capture the 15 and the 17 blade compressor signatures. Now, if the shaft breaks, what happens? The engine can continue to run, which means the part of the shaft that's still attached is rotating at, let's say, 700 per second. The compressor blades and the turbine blades are still running. But there's no power going to the gearbox now. So the propeller speed is going to drop. Doesn't really matter whether it drops or it increases. The real point is that they separate now. Instead of having this fixed relationship, they separate. And you would see the engine line increasing in frequency because the load is gone. And you would see the propeller decreasing in frequency because it's not being driven anymore. So this was really a nice diagnostic. Well, we could just do a spectrograph. This is a spectrogram, not Raven. This is my own spectrogram display. But it's not very good. What are you seeing? Up on top, 15N1, that's notation. That's the 15-blade compressor. N1, by the way, is a standard notation for the power shaft on a turbine engine. Just to orient you, because it's not important otherwise. 15N1 then is the 15-bladed compressor. 17N1 I didn't label. That's the line up a little bit higher than that. And then at 700 hertz, N1, that's the engine shaft, the engine core shaft rate. And then the propeller blade rate, PBR, is down a little bit lower yet. Well, this is not a good communications tool because it doesn't show the relationship between N1 and 15N1. 15N1's got some character to it. This, by the way, is the initial part of the takeoff of the test flight. So you see low rate, and then the rate increases. It does some wiggling around. You see that in the 15N1 and the 17N1, but you don't see that in the N1 and the PBR. It's not because it's not there, it's because what's constant is the fraction of the line itself. So if the frequency is high to begin with, the change is going to be large. If the frequency is small to begin with, the change is going to be large. But if we do it in percentage change, then we get a reasonable representation, and that's what I chose to do. I chose to separate these out. Now, we really only need two of these to see what's happening. One associated with the engine and one associated with the propeller. But I used three lines, two of them associated with the engine and one associated with the propeller. That just gives some additional confidence that we're really looking at the right lines. Could have used even more of the line structure, but this was certainly good enough. Each of these has a nominal value. This again is standard terminology for turbine engine aircraft. There will be a 100% rating of these things. So for example, the engine core shaft, the N1 line, 100% is 695.5 per second. That's the rate for that, at 100%. The engine is governed with a feedback mechanism, and under normal operation, it will maintain RPM at whatever you set it to within about plus or minus 5%. So we have a range. I drew plus or minus 10% here. The 100 in each case indicates the nominal frequency. And then we're talking percentages here. Now, people get an idea of percentages from different things like sales tax or tipping at a restaurant. They know about percentages of things. Well, not so much for sales tax because they don't have sales tax in many of the towns in Alaska, but they presumably tip their restaurant staff if they want to return there at some point in the future. So you can talk about it in that term. 10% of $10 is $1. 10% of $50 is $5. It's an easy sort of thing to go through in your head. And then you remind them that 10% is a lousy tip, so don't do it if you want to go back. For the propeller blade rate, 100% translates to 102.6 per second. For the 15-bladed compressor, 100% translates to 10,500 per second. But each of the lines has the same shape. This engine is running normally. You also get to explain something about what's happening here in resolution. Lower frequency, I'm trying to resolve 1 or 2 per seconds here. High frequency, I only need to resolve 1,000 plus or minus 1,000 So I can get much better frequency resolution for the high-end lines as I do for the low-end lines. And that's what you see when these are getting blurry. At any rate, once established, then I can carry this argument through and show what happens in different circumstances. This is a shot of the engine shaft rate and the propeller blade rate through that maneuver that I showed you the video. And it illustrates another thing about the practical aspects of signal analysis. Sometimes things surprise you, and this was a surprise to me. At any rate, the engine shaft rate, governor is acting to keep this running at just slightly under 100% up until the first red dashed line, the dashed line on the left. But a little bit before that. The pilot now is starting to input control moves. Remember, right hand on the power lever. So he's moving that. And he's also flying the airplane. He's trying to counteract this strong rolling tendency. So lots of interesting things are going on with the engine shaft rate. It's a combination of reaction to his input and the feedback mechanism that's trying to keep the airplane at 100%. Propeller blade rate drops out for part of this. And of course, the plaintiff's attorney would say, first dashed red line, that's when the shaft failed. And now you're not seeing the propeller anymore. But you are, it comes back again. It comes back with the right ratio. So it can't have broken and welded itself back together. This is from the iPhone 5 on the test flight aircraft. But we also have a measurement microphone on there. The measurement microphone has no compression. It has no funky psychoacoustic stuff going on. And it does the same thing as this does. Well, what's happening? What's happening is speculative. And that, all I could give were a number of listings for things. For one thing, the strength of the signal produced by the propeller, for example, is proportional in some way to the power it's supplying, the power being expended. So if you picture this airplane steeper, 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 now it's gotten to the point where it's lost lift on the wing and it's going to just drop away. It's not pushing as hard on the air anymore through that period of time. So that could be part of this. Another part of it could be the flow pattern past the airplane, because the closer you get to the core of the flow pattern past the airplane, the higher the levels would be. Conversely, if you're in a situation where the flow is being disturbed and going at a funky angle, it might not couple very well into the cabin. So there are a couple of reasons this could be true, but the ground truth here is on the far right. That's that after this sequence happened, the lines came back in their expected ratio. So now back to the trial. What happens from this point on? Plaintiff's reports were due first. This is typical. I don't know if it's actually required, but typically plaintiff stuff happens first and then defendant stuff happens in response to that. And then there can be a response to that again. So I had read the reports from the other side. I wrote my report. Next step was deposition. The deposition, you sit at the end of a long table. There's a court reporter with a camera on the far end videotaping you. Other attorneys can sit along the side, but they're not in the frame at all. And this is an opportunity for the plaintiff's attorney to question you. The opposition attorney is the one that talks through the deposition. I think I talked about that a little bit here. This is also the major time for discovery. That is the transfer of anything relevant that I have to the opposition. And this is interesting because it can be anything that's written down, anything that's documented. The plaintiff's attorney can ask for it, and the defense has to provide it. Same way the other way around as well. So anything you write. Emails, for example. I learned early on not to write anything substantive in an email. Our email contacts with this attorney were primarily, could I give you a call in 2 hours? Or could I give you a call tomorrow? That was it. That was it. And they would say, yeah, let's do it at 9 a.m. And we would talk on the phone because there is no record of the conversations on the phone. But the emails, it was there. And it would be really easy to mess up. We had a famous mess up here at Penn State. Michael Moore sent an email to a colleague talking about global warming mechanisms, climate change mechanisms. And he said in that email at one point, in order to resolve this particular result here, we used a trick. We set a derivative equal to 0. That's not what it was, but you could picture doing that. You could picture doing that. I could say, well, I'm going to use this little mathematical trick here, and I'm going to set the derivative equal to 0. Well, it's not a trick, but if somebody reads that and says, oh, they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes, they're doing something bad. Well, the university actually investigated and they found it was perfectly fine. But things like that can happen. They asked for my expense reports. I was required to report time and expenses. They asked for all of those. It's one of their common strategies is to point out to the jury how much somebody's being paid to render these opinions. The attorneys on the defense side didn't think much of that. They didn't really care that they were going to do it because they figured if the jury knows everybody's getting paid up there, nobody's volunteering for this stuff. Tests you perform, videos, that sort of thing. Had an embarrassing moment during the test flights when the test director and the pilot were sitting in just airplane on the ground and they're talking about what's coming up, and they made a joke about something. I don't even remember what the subject was. But that's something that the opposition could say, hey, these guys aren't taking this seriously. They're not professionals. Anyway, interesting. Pretrial motions, also interesting strategies here. I told you that they disallowed the conclusions of the Transportation Safety Board. They also disallowed anyone on the defense side, the one supporting the engine. They disallowed any remarks about what the pilot was doing. What I told you before, I could not say in court that the pilot is moving the power lever, and that's causing this fluctuation. The plaintiff's attorneys argued that that was something we had no way of knowing, and that's true. We had no way of knowing that, so they disallowed that. A number of different things like that. Also, they can disallow an expert's testimony completely if they can prove that it's not reliable or relevant, or they can disallow parts of the testimony, and that was also done. Talked about the deposition a little bit, and what the attorneys told me, since I was my first time, they're trying to make this transition as gentle as they can. But they said that what you'll see is not a back and forth discourse or argument about something physical. So what they're trying to do is get extra information out of you, but they also don't want to reveal their strategy at the trial. So it's this funny balancing act that you go through. And sometimes you can't even understand why somebody's asking the question that they're asking. Clearly, if there's a discrepancy between what you say in the deposition and what you said in your report, you're in trouble. You have to resolve that somehow. It happens, but you have to resolve it, and the opposing counsel is going to make a great deal about that. Finally, the trial, February 2023, just about a year ago. Trial was in federal court in Alaska. It's a civil trial, and one of the aspects of a civil trial is the verdict doesn't have to be unanimous. I don't know what the verdict was. I don't know what the vote was. They ruled in favor of the engine manufacturer, that the evidence was strong enough. But I don't know whether it was 5-4 or 3-6, whatever. There's no requirement to have 12 people on the jury. In fact, there were 11 on this jury. But that's peculiar to a civil trial. I got some advice about the testimony. And a lot of this stuff is pretty common sense stuff that could help you even think your way through a general presentation when it's not a hostile audience. You're not hostile, are you? I'm not hearing any no's. So clearly, don't bore them to tears. Be brief if you can. Simple but not condescending. Just remember where these folks are. They're recruited from the general population in primarily Anchorage and the metropolitan Anchorage area. So they could be doing all kinds of things. In fact, one of the attorneys specifically told our little group of expert witnesses, say, don't get into any fights with locals because you might be fighting with one of the jurors. I sort of think don't get into fights with the locals is generally a good idea. Not everybody. One piece of advice that I think was great. The jury is the audience for your testimony. During the direct examination, a friendly lawyer is asking you questions, but he or she isn't the audience. During the cross-examination, the unfriendly opposition attorney is questioning you. He's not the audience. The judge isn't the audience. The jury's the audience. So he said, look at the jury. It takes a little bit of doing. Somebody asks you, they're about 90 degrees apart too. So facing out. This way, attorney asks a question, I answer it. What I noticed was that for some of the other experts, they would get into this eyeball to eyeball dialogue with the attorney. And you could see the jury tuning out after a while. But looking at them was really helpful. It's like a group here. It's like teaching. It was much harder during COVID to teach when you couldn't see directly smiles, frowns, snoring, head hitting table. It was much harder to do it without those cues. So looking at the jury really helped a lot. Obviously, well, maybe it's not so obvious. Don't fight with the opposition. It's kind of a hard thing for some people to do because you're saying, no, I know the answer. I know the right answer. You're not asking the right question. Doesn't go over very well. Cross-examination is a bigger stressor than I even thought it would be. This was a big surprise, how much difference there is psychologically in the courtroom. You're talking in friendly, supportive tones to your counsel, and then all of a sudden switches to the opposition. Now, it's not that this guy was particularly nasty, but it was very clear to me that he was on the other side of the fence and he was trying to do anything he could to trip me up, to get me to say things that he could use later on. And this was jolting to me. I probably looked like a deer in the headlights for 15 or 20 minutes, maybe at the beginning. Now, in a crazy kind of way, it sort of helped me out because a number of people said, wow, you were really cool during that cross-examination. Yeah, comatose was a little better description of what it was. I expected, I knew that they were going to prep me. My counsel was going to prep me. But I figured what they would do at some point would be to do a mock cross-examination. They would get another attorney that I hadn't met yet from the same firm, and we'd sit down in a room together and he'd go after me. No, they didn't do that. The total of jury preparation was talking about the direct examination, not the cross-examination. So that also left me a little bit open there. During the cross-examination, another thing I didn't realize would happen, and I wasn't coached about this either. Often what the opposing counsel is doing is looking for little sound bites that he or she can use during closing argument. He's not carrying the argument to its logical conclusion during the cross-examination. And that really was jolting to me when I encountered it the first few times. I was thinking, we're not finished talking about this. And he just stopped and moved on to some other topic. And then it would happen again. Well, we're having this dialogue here, and all of a sudden quits and he turns to something else. Well, apparently it's not to me, but a well-known strategy to keep talking until you get some statement that he can use in the closing arguments. Because of the closing argument, I'm not there. I can't defend that anymore. It would be up to my attorney to defend against that. Little things, we talked about word usage and all, again, kind of obvious. The last line here, the brilliant response. I had some really award-winning responses to questions. It's just a shame that it happened a half an hour after I left. True. So in the end, how much difference did my testimony make? I don't know. You'd really have to talk to the jurors because the case was in their hands. Find out what did right, what did wrong. We did have a jury consultant there watching the whole trial, and she came up to me afterwards and said, the jury loved you. You were one of the few that looked at them when you were talking to them. So I would rate that as one of the top 10 things to know if you're going to be in a situation like this, and it actually does go to trial. Would I do it again? Sometimes people have asked me that. Trouble is, I'm too old. I was hired in 2016 for a trial that came off in 2023. So that's about 7 years. If I started another cycle like that, I would be almost certainly completely senile by the time the trial came along.
Presidential material.
But I wouldn't shy away from doing it except for that. I think it was a fascinating experience. I'm glad I had the experience. I'm glad it went all the way to trial because a lot of times these things are settled and you don't get the final word there. But the engine manufacturer was adamant and said, we don't want to say that we did something wrong when we didn't do anything wrong. So it carried all the way through. Anyway, that's all I have for you. Thank you very much. And now for the cross-examination.
A few minutes for cross, anyone?
Sure.
Were you allowed to watch the trial outside of your testimony, or like even if you didn't know you would you have been allowed to?
Good question. The question was, was I allowed to watch the trial? These trials are open to the public, but not to the expert witnesses until they've testified. Once my testimony was over, then I could come back and I could watch. And I did watch a couple of the experts after me go. But yeah, there are rules about that sort of thing. Good question. Yeah.
Were the jurors ever able to ask you directly any follow-up questions, or is there no communication allowed between you and the jurors?
Were the jurors ever allowed to address me directly, ask me questions? I actually don't know, but no one tried to do that. I don't know if they're allowed. It would have to go through the judge. Everything like that has to go through the judge. So they would have to say, could I ask a question, or maybe they would have to pose the question. It just didn't come up. So I honestly don't know. It's a good question though.
How much of your time, energy, whatever, did you spend doing the science part versus the communication part?
So how did I divide the task up into communication and science? That's a great question. I'd have to think about that a little bit. It a lot of times blended together, and it would be a little bit difficult to separate. But it certainly was sort of equal footing. I knew anything that I had to put into a report or in front of a jury had to be accessible to that audience. So it always colored what I was doing technically, but sort of equal weight maybe. How's that for wishy-washy?
I was surprised, as you were, that they didn't do a cross-examination practice. And I'm just wondering if the plaintiff that you were working for did that to cut costs. I mean, it would have been 3 lawyers for that amount of time, plus you, plus maybe some people analyzing things. So it would have been another $10,000 or something of cost, because the lawyers are getting 5 times whatever it was you had the courage to charge.
Yeah, it wasn't a question of cost. The question was, did they not do the cross-examination prep because of cost? I'm going to guess that wasn't a factor, because they spent plenty of time doing the direct prep for me. We spent hours going over the direct examination. So I'm kind of thinking it wasn't cost, but I don't know why. I don't know why you wouldn't do that. I mean, clearly it's phony. You'd know that your career wasn't hanging in the balance. So it's phony in that sense. But it seems like at least you could try that. I don't know. It puzzled me. Question?
Maybe I missed this, or maybe you aren't allowed to say, but like, who was suing who?
The question was, who was suing who? I can talk about anything that's in the public record. I can't talk about stuff that's not in the public record, but that is in the public record. So Honeywell Aerospace was the defendant, and the relatives of the folks who passed away represented the plaintiffs. Yeah. If you did a web search, you'd actually get some newspaper articles on that. Nobody else?
I have a question online.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I guess I'll just read it. I used to work as a consultant for an engineering firm that did a lot of legal cases. And when I was doing that, I felt a really strong disconnect between like the exploratory, ooh, that's cool mindset of a scientist or like a researcher, and the take a position and advocate for it position of an attorney. And I also felt a very strong pressure to be very sure of my interpretation early on, even in the face of an increasingly complex problem, which of course, as a researcher, originally I would go, ooh, cool, let's get into that. Did you experience anything like that? And how did you deal with it?
Yeah, great question. This whole question about what pressure are you exposing yourself to when you get into a situation like this, I think is relevant. I would have to say that I was very well matched to the problem in this case, and I don't think that would necessarily always be true. In fact, I'm sure it wouldn't always be true. It just was a really good match because I've spent a long time looking at rotating machinery, looking at signatures, that sort of thing. So it was a good fit, and also I did not feel pressure from my hiring attorneys group. They didn't try to steer me in a particular direction. Now, I mean, they were really happy that it worked out, but they always had the option of not using my testimony if they didn't like the way it was. I see what you're saying. Rachel, is that you, Rachel?
Yep, that's me.
Good to hear from you. Yeah, I can see that. I don't think I'd want to work for a firm that did this. I think the opportunities I've had in acoustics have been really fantastic. And this was one particular adventure off to the side, a little tangential adventure. But I could see that being kind of mind-numbing. And you'd be under pressure at times to kind of compromise your belief. Now, I was never put under that pressure. So again, it probably was a best case.
I guess in my situation, it wasn't that I was pressured to go one way or another, but I was pressured to have a story and stick to it. And I kind of like to dig into a problem, and I'm a researcher again now for that very reason.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get it. I think I might have missed part of that point. Yeah, there certainly is pressure to stick to it. When I wrote the report, that was really it. That was my argument, even though it was written in 2017 and delivered in 2023. There were things that had come up along the way that I would like to have inserted into the process, but they really weren't that interested in it. They were interested in what was in the report, and let's carry on. So in that sense, yeah, I think it was similar.
Cool, thank you. Good to see you.
You bet. Yes.
This is like a quick technical question, but was it not feasible to put like a tachometer or something on the shaft during the recreation flight test?
Question was, how about putting a tachometer on the drive shaft? Great idea. That'd be a great measurement to have. There'd be some other ways of instrumenting too that we didn't go through, but that would have been particularly tough because the shaft itself is buried down deep in the engine. And if you make any modifications at all, they have to be approved by the FAA before you can fly. So in fact, they did some ground tests with accelerometers, but they had to take the accelerometers off to do the flight test. That's how carefully they watched that. Yeah, good idea.
Like, I assume you thought of it, but I know that's a reason why you couldn't do it.
Yeah. Yes.
How did you end up getting, recruited or hired for this case?
It was one of you that did it to me. The head of the Boeing sound and vibrations group is a graduate of our program, and they initially approached him, and he said he didn't have time to do it or didn't want to do it for some reason. He said, "Why don't you contact Dr. Gabrielson?" So I've had people call me about other cases, and quite often I'll say this, it's really not my thing. It isn't my thing, but maybe you could try Joe Schmo. It's a funny kind of contorted web. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. My cross-examination was over 3 hours long. The whole sequence for me was a day, so it was a day in court. Thank you, though. Thank you. Enjoy the food.